Good morning. My name is Josh Erlinson. I am the data support lead here at IDX Broker. I've worked for the company for a little over 5 years and have seen and dealt with a number of different questions. One of the things that I do is I educate new employees on basically the data side of things. In other words, what does the technical or data side of things look like when we're talking about IDX and how we process it, how we deal with it? It's a very complex question and has obviously many, many facets to it. But one of the things that is sort of a specialty or focus within that, I should say, is how to deal with what I typically refer to as a dense market area. So, what do I mean by that? Well, dense market areas are areas that geographically have enough population density that they've basically resulted in multiple MLSs or multiple listing services popping up in the same area or overlapping, in fact. You see this in places like Florida, where you see things like Cephal, Southeast Florida, Jupiter, Fort Lauderdale, beaches, things like that. You see this in California, where you have the Bay Area MAX boards, including Bridge or EBRD, MLS listings, Carrot, CRMLS. You see it in Texas, where you have, entities like North Texas or Central Texas or Austin or San Antonio. These areas could have overlapping areas. You see this in New York with places like Rebney, Manhattan. Further a little bit north is New York Sam, but again, these are all basically dense market areas. So what happens? Well, what happens is essentially you have competing MLSs all looking at the same target geographical area. You have agents and brokers wanting to leverage that because, well, there are buyers in that area. So what ends up happening is you have agents that are potentially listing things on either multiple feeds. They could be listing it in one feed but not the other. But that kind of thing happens basically in these kind of very dense market areas. One of my favorite kind of anecdotes surrounding this is when I was relatively new here. I was speaking to somebody on a support call, and that person was calling because they were looking for a couple of listings that they weren't finding in their feed. Just so happened to be, I think it was a Miami area condominium building, if I remember correctly, but I know it was Florida. But they were basically looking for a few listings that they knew were all in the same building, all active, available condos that, well, should be there. What we came to find out, and this is one of those that it was over the course of a good 45-minute phone call, but what we came to find out was that though there were, in fact, 3 different available units in the exact same building with the same address, they were represented by 3 different MLSs. In other words, they were literally listed in 3 different locations, even though they were the exact same building. Now, what does this mean in terms of how you deal with that? The same thing holds true for other market areas as well. Like I said, things like the Bay Area, things like Los Angeles. What do we do when we're looking at those things? Well, one of the things to keep in mind is the difference between reciprocity from the agent or broker's viewpoint versus what we deal with as an IDX vendor and what an actual IDX feed from a given association looks like. So one of the kind of ways that you can differentiate these is in how we literally access these feeds. To us as an IDX vendor, when we refer to a feed, what we're really referring to is an access point. We basically have a URL and a set of credentials with which we access a remote server and download the listing data that corresponds to a particular query. Typically, we do things like look for, hey, give me all active or active and pending or active and the sub statuses underneath active for a given feed on a given day or given hour or given 12-hour, whatever that iteration looks like. But we basically are literally just hitting a URL with credentials and a particular query or question in this case. Give me these listings. What matches this? when we talk about dense market areas and how it relates to that, there may be, let's say, multiple feeds in a place like Florida, for example, or in California or New York, where we're literally downloading geographical data from the same location. In other words, the same, let's say Manhattan, let's say, Long Island. But there may be different MLSs that are giving us that data. There are different access points with which we're receiving it. It's important because to us, these are unique entities. To an agent, to a broker, in fact, to a consumer, I suppose, these might actually make sense to kind of put them together, to conglomerate them. But technically speaking, from our end, we have to maintain their autonomy. We have to treat them as separate entities. So, this is sort of one of those conundrums that we run into with these kind of dense market areas is we have to access these feeds independently or individually. We have to associate them with IDX broker accounts independently or individually. But to a consumer, to an agent, to a broker, they really are more fundamentally kind of the same thing, right? How do we deal with this? One of the things that is important to keep in mind is that in dense market areas, you want basically to consolidate as much as possible. Like I said, to us, they're individual feeds. To you, the agent, broker, consumer, they're more consolidated or conglomerated. So one of the ways that you can get around this is doing things like putting together community pages or landing pages. They're referred to by various names, but essentially the idea being is that you put together a page that says basically, hey, here is a particular condominium, or here is a particular complex, or a particular neighborhood that has a lot of these listings in it, let's say. The reason you do this is that it's good for SEO, good for SEM. By tailoring a search or by tailoring predefined results around a particular building, let's say, you've already built in a particular amount of cachet to that building. In other words, there are famous buildings, let's say, condominiums that may have hundreds of units in them that have name recognition to them. So as an agent, you get a listing in one of those. That's a good value to your business as well as to your consumers because you've got name recognition built into the listing even before you actually do anything in terms of advertising, right? So you want to try to leverage that as much as possible. Well, that's one of the reasons why you might put together a landing page for a dense market area. Why would you do that? Well, in this case, like I said, not only do you want the name recognition of that, but by putting together a kind of a landing or community page using IDX, you can consolidate different sources of that information or that data. Well, how would you maybe do that, right? So one of the examples that I like to bring up is if you have multiple feeds going into an IDX broker account in a dense market area, like Miami, like Los Angeles, like something like that, right? You may have multiple feeds on the account, in which case you might need to put together, let's say, multiple searches, right? If your search doesn't necessarily cover more than one feed, then you could do something like widgets, for example. In other words, you want to put together something that gives you kind of a thumbnail view, let's say, right? By adding these together or stacking them, right, you can make it look on your page as though these are all coming from the same area, when in fact you may be pulling from 3, 4 different actual IDX sources or feeds in this case. There's a number of advantages to building out pages like this that utilize multiple feeds. And one of the things about them is it, to the end user, still looks more seamless. In other words, you want them to basically feel like they're in a consolidated area. One of the other things that we get as far as the technical side from our end, what does this look like? One of the bigger issues is supporting and investigating multiple feed accounts. As I mentioned earlier, my anecdote about the Florida condominium building that had 3 different feeds represented within the same place. That is an excellent example of somebody, let's say, calling us up, talking to our support staff and saying, I'm looking for these listings. They're missing. I should be able to see them. And we agree with you. You should be able to see them. The reason being is that your association may have reciprocity agreements, like in the case of Florida. And I know I keep going back to that one, but it's just such an obvious example. You have associations like the four that I mentioned at the top of this broadcast: Cephal, or Miami Association of Realtors, Jupiter, Tequestahopee Sound, Fort Lauderdale, Realtors Association of the Palm Beaches. These four associations, from everything that I understand in talking to client members of them, have essentially a reciprocity agreement where when they're logged into the back end, or when the agents and brokers are logged into the back end of the system, they can see other associations that they have this agreement with, right? So in other words, if I'm a Miami Association of Realtors person, I may, when I'm logged into the back end of my system, be able to see Fort Lauderdale listings, for example. But when it comes to the IDX side of things, those are still sent out as two separate, unique entities. And so when you're investigating something from our end on the technical side, you have to keep that in mind. One of the first questions that I always ask myself when people are calling in these kind of areas is, hey, are you actually looking in the right feed? That's almost the first and foremost question is the feed on your account the one that listing actually resides in? If it's not, there we go. There's your explanation right there. End of story. We've found out that it's just simply not in the feed that you're using. And you can then add additional feeds to your account, or, if it's your listing, maybe you want to look into becoming a member of another association where you can list it. Maybe you want to put that listing in the association that you're a part of. Things like that. So when it comes to troubleshooting those kind of things, that is 99% of the time really what we find, is that in these dense market areas, if you're missing a listing, there's a good possibility that it's just simply in an overlapping feed that is not on your account. That's kind of one of the bigger differences also, because many associations, they might have these reciprocity agreements with other entities around them, but they still maintain their IDX feed separately. Why they do this is entirely up to them. That's one of those things that there are numerous logistical reasons from their end why they might do that. It could be that they have a contract with a particular data vendor like Paragon or CoreLogic. It could be that they run their own infrastructure and wish to maintain it that way. It's basically, there are a number of possibilities as to why that could be, but the fact of the matter is that many of these do. Now, there's another interesting variant of this issue, which is, what about a dense market area that sends their listing out through multiple feeds? Best example that I can think of off the top of my head is Claw. That is the Los Angeles Association. Now, interestingly, they send their listing data out through multiple sources. They send it out both through Carrots as well as through CRMLS. We receive that data in two places. While we'd like to say that that data perfectly overlaps, in other words, it's exactly the same, in my experience, I have found differences in that. Now, why that is, again, gets into a much deeper logistical and complex issue. But this is one of the reasons why, for instance, when our sales team is speaking with a California customer, and they're not really sure exactly which MLS they should go with, which IDX feed they need, one of the reasons that we'll ask this question is, hey, what are your active listings? Let me look that up for you so that we can make sure that you're on the right feed. Because in these kind of situations, it's basically an ounce of preventative medicine to prevent a pound of pain later. In this case, so often people will not necessarily be sure about what feed they should be on, and especially when it comes to something like Carrots versus CRMLS. If I'm a member of Claw, I may not be sure genuinely. So that's one of the reasons why both sales and support here at IDX, will ask somebody, hey, give me an example of one of your listings. Give me an example of a listing that's yours or that you're looking for. We can usually then track that down or kind of reverse engineer it to figure out which one of those feeds you should be on. There are other examples of this as well. things like Wirex, which is in the North Midwest, is a composite or a conglomeration of 8 different associations or so. I think it's at least 8. Southwest Florida is very similar. It's comprised of Naples, Bonito Stera, and the Gulf Coast, I believe. But they're examples of a conglomeration of a number of associations putting together their listings into one feed, as opposed to one of the things that we were talking about earlier, which is everybody separating out their feeds. Now, interestingly enough, this is also a trend that we've seen more and more over the past, well, probably year plus, and I think it's something that's going to continue, is we're going to see smaller associations continue to pool their resources, and specifically their listings in this case. There are a number of reasons why they would do that, cost effectiveness, efficiency, among them. But I think that one of the other reasons is to try and help solve this issue, this exact issue, which is, hey, what if I have listings in the same city, but that are on different feeds? How do we deal with that? Well, one of the ways in which they are dealing with that is consolidation. And we're seeing that more and more. You see that in MLSs like Bright or Smart, among some recent ones, that have basically decided to, rather than try to kind of cobble together a la carte all these different IDX feeds, let's, from a technology standpoint, put them together into one unified resource, which honestly makes it so much easier for us, for people like IDX vendors, for people like data vendors, to basically be able to deliver that to as an end product to a consumer. So that's one of those trends that I think we're going to continue to see, not only this year, but we're going to continue to see that, I think, in the years to come. More and more associations will probably go toward that model, and it's basically for this reason. Now, one of the things this does do is, when you talk about how an IDX vendor looks at these, well, what about that case where, let's say, I'm a Florida agent, I have multiple feeds on an IDX broker account. What does that look like in practical terms? Well, one of the things that looks like is there's always the chance for duplication, right? In other words, let's say that I've got 2 feeds on the account. I'm an agent and I've got the listing in question, or a listing in question, listed in both of these feeds, right? I want maximum coverage for that, so I've chosen to become a member and list with both of these entities. And I want that entity, or I want that listing, to be on my website. Makes sense? So the problem, though, is when I do a search for, let's say, that address, just for example, do I get duplicates? Well, that is a live possibility. The system that IDX Broker has built will, in fact, remove duplicate listings if and only if they share the same listing ID number. In other words, their actual internal MLS ID number. It's one of those things where most MLSs will have unique IDs in some sense, or at least in that particular sense. So it is always possible that if you're doing a search on an IDX Broker account for a specific, let's say, address, you've got it listed in multiple sources. It could come up duplicating. That is a possibility, if and only if the listing IDs are different. Now, this is one thing that we're actually working on, and one of the reasons that we're working on this is for dense market areas. But we're working on basically other ways in which to determine the similarity of a listing to another listing. So, for example, if the listings that come up from the same search results, right, if they have different listing IDs but are similar enough in other ways, then what confidence do I have that we're looking at the same listing? That's one of the problems that we're trying to address. And that's one of those things that really does become a more and more complicated question the more you dive into it, but is incredibly pertinent when, dealing with these kind of denser areas. One of the other things that can happen is, let's say that you might have listings that are on or off market, depending on where their source is. Now, this is an interesting question that comes up when you're looking at things like the difference between an association sending out the feed one way versus another. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. In Florida, for example, and I know I keep going back to the well on that one, but hey, it's a target-rich environment. So in Florida, the associations themselves have a couple of different ways in which they can disseminate their data. They can do it directly, either themselves or through a data vendor in sort of what we consider a normal Rets feed, or just directly from the MLS, in other words. Or they can disseminate it through the Florida Association of Realtors, who in turn acts as a data vendor and sends us data that way. The thing is that there's two different vectors there that information can take in order to get to us. There could be, and there have been cases, where those two different vectors may not be in perfect alignment at any given moment in time. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, if I've got an account that's using one of the FAR feeds, and I've got an account that's using a direct feed, I could be looking at the same listing on two different screens and have different statuses on those. Or, let's say somebody updated a listing price or something along those lines, right? Either a status of the listing itself, the price, something along those lines. But the idea being is that this is another point where you could end up with information diverging, even though it's coming from the same area. So this is another thing that IDX vendors, such as ourselves, have to take into consideration. We kind of come back around to, how do I deal with this? Again, one of my best pieces of advice is in terms of, putting listings onto your site in areas like this. I really do recommend going with widgets. Going with smaller sort of thumbnail views that you can stack one on top of the other, as well as add additional information to on the page itself, is a great way to consolidate these. So again, even if I have, let's say, 3 feeds on my account, I can build a widget in the same neighborhood on each one of those feeds, have maybe a handful of listings, let's say like one row of 4 or 5 listings, let's say. I can stack those literally one on top of the other, make it look like they're part of the same table structure, when in fact they're coming from different sources. This is a way that until technology catches up and consolidates in the way that, things like CRMLS, Smart, Bright, until, Southwest Florida is another example, until these places, or until the technology can catch up and consolidate to make it easy and readily available to put into one widget, let's say. Stacking them is a great alternative. You can also, because of that, then have much more direct control over the page. Put additional information, put neighborhood statistics, photos, other links, things like that. What are other ways that we can deal with this? Well, one of the ways that IDX Broker offers is we also offer, in addition to the basic and advanced search, we offer an address search. So that case that I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, the Florida case, where we had 3 different units in the same condominium building, represented by 3 different MLSs. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that I had all 3 of those MLSs hooked up to my IDX Broker account. Using the address search as my starting point, I could search by the actual building, have it search across all of the feeds on my account, and not have to worry about which feed it might be pulling from. So in other words, an address search would cover the case that we had talked about earlier. That is one of those things, and I've got a few examples, but there are examples of sites that literally revolve around this business model. They revolve around sticking to just a particular building or set of buildings. One of the nice things also about the address search is that, let's say that you're looking for an area, maybe a short stretch of buildings, or let's say that it's one of those cases where the complex that you're trying to identify or target spans more than one street number. Well, much like other data fields that IDX Broker uses, you can use a min and max style value on those. But let's say that my condo complex in this case spans 2 or 3 different street numbers. I can have the same street, a name, and say I want a minimum number of 314 and a maximum number of 316. That'll make sure that I get not just the singular address, but I get units available throughout the complex. So it's one of those kind of tricks that you can use to identify multi-building kind of environments like that. One of the other ways that these are useful is in doing blogs or advertisements, things that are pointing back to your original website source. So one of the other reasons that I recommend widgets is that they're just tiny bits of portable code that can be dropped just about anywhere. So, like I said, into your blog, into your advertisement, your digital advertisement. Anything that points back to your original source is fantastic for your SEO value. It's really a good way to build up link credibility, if you will, on Google, Yahoo, etc. One of the other ways and one of the other tools that we have to kind of handle this dense market area conundrum is we also have now built a polygon search. Not that uncommon among real estate search services, but definitely another tool at your disposal. Rather than using either an address or using a particular, let's say, like neighborhood, you can literally draw points on a map that are identifying a particular area. And the polygon is another one of those that's incredibly useful when dealing with it. Much like the address search, you can use it to narrow it down to a specific area, but still account for any overlapping associations or feeds that you might have going into that particular account. So, in conclusion, dense market areas are basically an ongoing issue. Clearly, as we urbanize more and more, and as more and more people, and specifically buyers, are consolidating into smaller areas, real estate agents and IDX vendors alike need to be able to deal with these. We basically try to do this in a number of ways that we've talked about today, doing things like landing pages, building widgets to cover multiple areas, using an address search, using the polygon search, things like that. We've seen it being dealt with from the origins side in terms of consolidation of associations. Like I said, things like Bright, Smart, CRMLS, WireX. These are all examples where associations have gotten together themselves from that end of things and said, hey, we recognize the demand for this. But it's something that's definitely not going to go away anytime. And it's something that you're going to want to account for if you are doing business in one of these kind of areas. Certainly something that you want to deal with, not only in just your advertising on your website, but in terms of how you think about these things. And, maybe it's a question of, hey, do I really want all of these feeds? Do I get the most bang for my buck out of just one, let's say, in particular, and then assume that, yeah, I might be missing a few listings here and there, but not as many? These are all live questions, but they're all questions that essentially relate to what happens when you have a lot of listings in a very small area. Again, my name was Josh. I do appreciate you tuning in and listening, and hope to hear from you. If you have any questions, obviously you can feel free to send an email to our very knowledgeable support staff. They're at help@idxbroker.com. Direct any questions to them. I think that's pretty much all I had for this morning. So thank you again for tuning in, and I hope everybody has a great day, and I will talk to you later.